11. Based on the passage, Leo XIII would be most likely to agree that the economic conditions of his era attest to which basic relationship. We're also going to be doing this with number 12. So we want to find the economic conditions, what basic relationship is related to those conditions, and we're looking for between 1 and 20. So as we're reading 1 to 20, which is the first paragraph in a piece, the first paragraph is really the key here, where it talks about essentially you have a great imbalance between employers and workers, that, as it says here, there's this usury, this sort of money lending as they define earlier here at a high rate, and then there's the sort of hiring of labor, the conduct of trade, which are concentrated in the hands of few, so that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. So in other words, massive inequality, power, wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. They are able then to essentially dictate the terms to workers who are working in conditions and for remuneration that is not very good, shall we say. So something like that. So I go to my choices. It doesn't talk about modifications to laws that are heightening those tensions. But I like B. Social inequality worsens as the economy increasingly comes under the control of a select group of business people. This is that idea of that power being concentrated into the hands of a few. That seems to fit. Competition between business and a particular sector influences the morale of the workers in that sector. I don't even know what that's referencing. Measures meant to protect workers from economic exploitation have the unintended effect of encouraging. No, this is like A. A and D are really similar, where it's basically saying the way to try to fix it's actually making it worse. But that's not what the passage is saying. It's really saying what's going on in B. Now, which lines would support that? I think our key lines are the ones that we've underlined right here, where it's like there's a small group of people that control the money and the hiring, and therefore they dictate the conditions to the workers, which are very unpleasant. So I like 8 to 14. So 11 is B, 12 is C. 13, line 19, common. To remedy these wrongs, the socialists, working on the poor man's envy of the rich, are striving to do away with private property and contend that individual possessions should become the blank property of all, to be administered by the state or by municipal bodies. I would put in a word like shared, the shared property of all. So we go to our choices, anything that looks like that. Well, there we go, shared. So shared, joint could have been another word here that could have fit. But yeah, shared makes sense. Common property. Inferior, typical, frequent, they don't capture what we're looking for, which we see in choice A. 14, according to Leo, the desire to acquire property prompts individuals to what? So we need to find where they talk about individuals wanting property. And we see that specifically starting in these lines in particular. It says, it is surely undeniable that when a man engages in remunerative labor, the impelling reason and motive of his work is to obtain property. So there we go. First, to get property, they engage in work, paid work. So that's an important clue. The other important clue is here. It says, if one man hires out to another his strength or skill, he does so for the purpose of receiving in return what is necessary for the satisfaction of his needs. And then it goes on from there to describe essentially, acquiring money and property to dispose with as he wishes. So ultimately what it means here is when people want property, when they want possessions, money, they get a job. They hire out their strength or skill to another. In other words, they sell their labor to an employer. So we go to our choices. Do they feel envious of other possessions? They might, but it doesn't say that in the passage. Seek work from the employer. That's what we saw. I didn't see anything here about viewing work as more dignified than they otherwise would. It's just not something that came up. D is another one of those choices like A. That's probably true. Like if you want to acquire a property, you're going to need to put off short-term wants to save for the long term. So the one that is mentioned though is B. 15, line 45, the phrase little estate. What does that refer to? Thus, if he lives sparingly, saves money, and for greater security invests his savings in land, the land in such case is only his wages under another form, and consequently a working man's little estate, thus purchased, should be as completely at his full disposal as are the wages he receives for his labor. So the little estate, they're referring to what's discussed here, the land, what he's investing his money into. So I like Land or other property owned by a wage earner, yeah, it's his stuff that he buys with the money he earned from working. It's not about status. It's not really about the neighborhoods where they live. It's about what they personally own. And it's not about the pay directly. They use the pay to buy stuff, and the stuff is the estate. So 15 is A. 16, why does Leo view socialism as threatening? So we need to see where Leo is commenting on socialism. And one of the major places is in the second paragraph, and sort of describes in the first lines what the socialists want to do. And then we see in line 25 what he thinks the problem with their positions is. So it says, but their contentions are so clearly powerless to end the controversy that were they carried into effect, the working man himself would be among the first to suffer. They are, moreover, emphatically unjust, for they would rob the lawful possessor, distort the functions of the state, and create utter confusion in the community. So he's saying their proposals, their ideas are not going to work. The only thing they're going to actually do is hurt the people who are already hurting, and do so by disrupting the state, creating confusion in the community, rob the lawful possessor, right? Rob people who own property lawfully, so on and so forth. So we're looking for a choice like that. And I like D, endangers certain conventions and institutions that are indispensable to society. Now, the institutions, that was the functions of the state part that we saw. In terms of conventions, you can think of conventions as typical habits, practices, or beliefs within a particular group or community. Part of it, I think, is here, where it's talking about sort of like the conventions of property ownership, like what that means and the expectations people have. But we can also see later in the passage as it develops, especially in these lines, that, if you take away property, you're taking away people's sort of expectations for a better future. You're taking away this sort of social contract in some sense. Like, in other words, people expect that, if I work, I'll make money and then I can buy stuff and better myself. It's kind of like this underlying belief that society has. And he's saying that if you enact this program that the socialists want to enact, you're going to undermine that. And so that's where we get this conventions and beliefs that are being undermined. Let's look at our other options just to check. Discourages disempowered groups from seeking greater recognition. It's not about recognition. It's not like, underprivileged group or something wanting to be recognized and have their voices heard. It's more economic-based issues. Contributes to widespread discontent over the pace of societal change. Didn't say anything about the pace of societal change. It doesn't also talk about the individual's willingness to make sacrifices benefiting society as a whole, because really it's almost the opposite. It decreases the individual's willingness to work hard for themselves if you take away this sort of property reward. So 16, therefore, is D. 17, what's one essential aspect of the concept of private property? So we go back to the passage where he talks about private property. The key lines, I think, for this one are here. He therefore expressly intends to acquire a right, full and real, not only to the remuneration, but also to the disposal of such remuneration, just as he pleases. In other words, they expect pay when they work. They expect to be able to use that pay to buy what they want, and they expect to be able to use what they buy for their own needs and ends and desires. So that's sort of the way property works. You get to get it, and then you get to use it how you want. And did they mention that somewhere else? I think, yeah, like this one right here as well. It must be within his right to possess things, not merely for temporary and momentary use, but to have and to hold them in stable and permanent possession, etc. So again, people expect they can use their property how and when they want without being told what to do. So when I look at our choices here, I like C, the freedom of property holders to determine what to do with their property. That's the use of it. Looking at the other choices, it doesn't talk about land being exchanged for other property. While B is probably true, isn't that something that he talks about, that, it's essential to the concept of private property that people can acquire property through frugality. It's just not something mentioned. The likelihood that those who purchase property will profit from its resale, again, don't really talk about reselling. And we're looking for an essential aspect of property, something that's fundamental to the concept, not just something that's kind of maybe true in some cases. C is what property is. Like, the whole idea of property is it's yours to do with as you please. If you can't do with it as you please, then is it really yours, right? So C is essential to what property is, whereas A, B, and D are just random. So 17 is C. 18 and 19, Leo 13th implies that those who wish to abolish the ownership of private property, aka the socialists, this is referencing them, fail to recognize that such ownership is beneficial in that. So we want to see where in the passage it talks about what the socialists fail to recognize about the benefits of ownership. And the main lines we're going to use here are right here. And notice it talks about the socialists. Socialists, therefore, by endeavoring to transfer the possessions of individuals to the community at large, strike at the interests of every wage earner, since they would deprive him of the liberty of disposing of his wages, and thereby of all hope and possibility of increasing his resources and of bettering his condition in life. So in other words, if you take away people's ability to own private property and amass private property, accumulate it, you are taking away, what we would call, or as I would call as an American, like the American dream, right? This idea of being able to better yourself through hard work and so on and so forth. So he would say that the socialists are not seeing that the benefit of property is that motivates people to improve their lives. It gives them hope that they can improve their lives. So we go to our choices and we look at our options, and I like B, provide members of the working class a means to improve their circumstances. Yep. Looking at the others, it doesn't really talk about a single set of values for the wealthy and working class. Induces workers to feel content with the compensation they receive for their labor. I mean, maybe, but more specifically, with the lines that we're using, we see more direct evidence for B. Helps to ensure that the various classes live in harmony. Again, it doesn't really mention that. It's about being able to better yourself. Whatever others are doing, however others are succeeding or not, if you have the belief that you can do better for yourself and your family, if you work hard and so on and so forth, acquire property, that's a benefit of this property scheme. So 18 is B. What lines did we use? We used 50 to 56, and so 19 is D. 20, discussion of animal creation in the last paragraph. So in the last paragraph, they mention animal creation right here, and they say, this is one of the chief points of distinction between man and the animal creation, for the brute has no power of self-direction. So again, talking about why this impulse to property is so important. It's something that separates us from animals, this idea of acquiring property and using property in the way that you want. So ultimately, it's asserting a central difference between humans and animals, property as something that is really specifically human in certain ways. So I like that one. Underscore humans' responsibilities towards animals. No, this is not about human rights. This is not about keeping, or animal rights. This is not about keeping animals as property. That's just not what's being discussed. And it's not drawing attention to the needs of humans and animals. It's asserting that difference or that distinction, right? They use that word. Leo uses the word, the distinction, difference. So therefore, 20 is A.